Sometimes the place where your life truly begins is the same place where everyone else assumes it ended. The warm scent of fresh bread drifted through the little bakery just as the bell above the front door gave a soft, familiar chime. Ethan Brooks looked up from the wooden counter, brushing a light dusting of flour from his hands onto his faded apron before offering the same gentle smile he gave every customer who walked inside. Morning sunlight spilled through the old front windows, turning rows of golden sourdough, cinnamon rolls, and buttery croissants into something almost sacred beneath the amber glow. The bakery had once been forgotten, its cracked brick walls hidden behind years of dust, boarded windows, and broken dreams. Now laughter floated softly between the shelves, coffee steamed from ceramic mugs, and neighbors lingered longer than necessary simply because the little shop made them feel that kindness still had a place in the world. Ethan had worked for that feeling one sunrise at a time, never asking for applause, never expecting recognition. The only reward he ever wanted was hearing his 9-year-old daughter laugh somewhere in the kitchen while humming along with the old radio that sat beside the antique mixer. Lily Brooks appeared from the back carrying a tray almost too large for her small arms. "Dad, these blueberry muffins are ready," she said proudly. Ethan hurried over, taking the heavier side without making her feel as though she needed help. "They look better every week," he whispered. Lily grinned. "That's because you finally admitted I was right about adding more cinnamon." Ethan laughed quietly. "I still think you're secretly trying to rewrite Grandma's recipe." "Maybe," she answered with a playful shrug. "But customers keep buying them." He looked at her for a second longer than usual. There had been years when smiles like hers felt impossible. Years when silence filled every room they entered because grief had settled into the walls like winter frost. Somehow this little bakery had given them both permission to breathe again. Outside, a sleek black luxury sedan eased to the curb, its polished finish reflecting the storefront sign that simply read Brooks Bakery. The driver stepped out first, opening the rear passenger door with practiced professionalism. A woman in an elegant cream-colored coat paused on the sidewalk before lifting her eyes toward the weathered brick building. Charlotte Hayes had visited hundreds of businesses during her career. She had stood inside towering headquarters, billion-dollar manufacturing plants, luxury hotels, and award-winning restaurants. Yet something about this modest bakery stopped her before she reached the entrance. Warm laughter drifted through the glass. Fresh bread carried memories she had buried years ago beneath board meetings, earnings reports, and impossible expectations. She placed one hand on the brass door handle, hesitating for only a heartbeat before stepping inside. The bell chimed gently. Ethan looked up automatically. His smile appeared before recognition did. Then time seemed to slow. Charlotte stopped walking. Ethan stopped breathing. Either of them spoke. Flour rested quietly across Ethan's hands. Charlotte's fingers loosened around the leather folder she carried until it hung silently at her side. 3 years disappeared without asking permission. She remembered a conference room with polished glass walls, legal documents stacked in perfect order, and one exhausted employee sitting across from her trying to remain calm while hearing the words that would dismantle his future. Ethan remembered the same room differently. He remembered thinking about how he would explain everything to his little girl before she got home from school. He remembered promising himself he would never let bitterness become the lesson she learned from watching her father. Around them, customers continued chatting, unaware that two strangers stood frozen inside a moment neither had ever expected to revisit. Lily peeked around the kitchen doorway, wiping flour from her cheek. "Dad?" she asked softly before noticing the unfamiliar guest. She smiled with effortless kindness. "Good morning. Welcome to Brooks Bakery." Charlotte blinked, almost surprised by the warmth in the child's voice. "Thank you," she answered quietly. Ethan finally found his own voice. Calm. Steady. Almost impossibly gentle. "Good morning." It was not the greeting Charlotte expected. No anger. No accusation. No bitterness sharpened by years of hardship. Only quiet dignity resting beneath tired but peaceful eyes. She searched his face for resentment, and found something far more unsettling. Peace. The kind that could never be purchased inside a boardroom or negotiated during a merger. Ethan reached toward the display case. Would you like to try today's cinnamon bread? It just came out of the oven. Charlotte stared at him for another silent moment before answering. Yes, she whispered. I think I would. Neither of them realized that this ordinary morning inside a forgotten neighborhood bakery was about to uncover a truth powerful enough to rewrite both of their lives. Because sometimes forgiveness begins long before the person who needs it ever walks through the door. Bien tap. Ethan carefully placed the warm loaf onto a wooden cutting board before reaching for the long bread knife. The gentle scrape of steel against the worn oak countertop filled the silence between them, not awkward, but thoughtful, as though the bakery itself understood that some conversations needed a few extra seconds before they could begin. Charlotte watched him with quiet disbelief. 3 years earlier he had worn pressed office shirts, carried engineering reports beneath one arm, and moved through the halls of Hayes Foods with the confidence of a man who believed honest work would always be enough. Now he wore a flower-covered apron instead of a company badge, and somehow he looked lighter than she had ever remembered. Ethan sliced the bread with practiced precision before placing a generous piece onto a small white plate. He added a pat of whipped butter beside it, and slid the plate gently across the counter. It is still warm, he said softly. Be careful. Charlotte accepted it with both hands. The bread released a rich aroma of butter, honey, and toasted wheat that instantly carried her back to Saturday mornings from her childhood, long before quarterly earnings, shareholder meetings, and endless flights had replaced simple joys. She tasted a small piece. The crust offered the perfect crispness before giving way to a soft center that almost melted away. She closed her eyes for a brief moment without meaning to. This is remarkable, she whispered. Ethan smiled politely. Thank you. Lily stepped beside her father with another tray of pastries. Dad says every loaf should make someone feel like they came home, she said proudly. Ethan chuckled. I also say you should not reveal all of our secrets to customers. Lily grinned. That one is too good to keep secret. Charlotte looked at the little girl. Did you help make these? Lily nodded enthusiastically. Every Saturday and every day after school. I mix dough, decorate cookies, and I am learning how to braid challah bread. Dad says good bread takes patience. Ethan looked toward his daughter with quiet pride. She learns faster than I do. Charlotte felt an unfamiliar weight settle inside her chest. She had spent years studying leadership seminars that claimed culture was built through strategy, incentives, and performance reviews. Yet this tiny bakery radiated something no corporate handbook had ever successfully explained. It felt safe. It felt genuine. It felt alive. A line slowly formed behind her as more customers entered. A retired firefighter greeted Ethan by name. A young nurse thanked Lily for saving her favorite cinnamon rolls. 2 construction workers joked about who had arrived first so neither would miss the apple turnovers that always sold out before noon. Ethan remembered every name, every regular order, every grandchild, every birthday, and every recovery from illness. Charlotte noticed that nobody treated him as merely the owner of a bakery. They treated him like family. She stepped aside to allow the morning rush to continue, taking a seat near the front window with her coffee. From there she watched Ethan move through the bakery with calm efficiency. He greeted each guest without hurry. He never appeared rushed even when orders stacked across the counter. Every conversation ended with a smile. Every goodbye sounded sincere. She wondered how someone who had once lost nearly everything could still possess such quiet generosity. Her thoughts drifted backward despite herself. She remembered the weeks leading up to the layoffs. The company had been under crushing financial pressure after several failed acquisitions and rising supply costs. Investors demanded immediate reductions. Department heads submitted lists of positions. Human resources prepared documents. Meetings stretched late into every evening until faces blurred together. Charlotte had signed hundreds of approvals during that exhausting month. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of lives she never truly had the chance to know. Ethan Brooks had been one signature among many. She had convinced herself that leadership sometimes required impossible decisions. Yet sitting inside this bakery, she realized something painful. She could still remember the sadness in his eyes from that meeting, but she had never once wondered what happened after he walked out of her office. Across the room, Lily suddenly waved. "Miss Hayes?" Charlotte looked up, surprised that the little girl had remembered her name from the credit card receipt. "Would you like another piece?" Oh, Charlotte remained by the window long after the breakfast crowd had begun to thin, her coffee now warm instead of hot, yet somehow untouched. Outside, people passed the bakery with relaxed smiles, some carrying fresh loaves beneath their arms while others paused simply to wave through the front glass. She had spent decades studying numbers because numbers never argued with emotion. Revenue, margins, forecasts, and market share all fit neatly into reports. Human lives did not. She quietly opened the leather folder resting on the table and looked down at the carefully prepared redevelopment proposal. Elegant architectural renderings stretched across glossy pages, showing boutique retail spaces, luxury apartments, landscaped courtyards, and modern cafes designed to attract affluent investors. Brooks Bakery occupied the center parcel. According to the plan, the old brick building would be purchased, demolished, and replaced with a sleek commercial structure expected to increase the district's annual revenue by millions of dollars. 3 days earlier she would have signed the approval without hesitation. Now the polished illustrations suddenly felt strangely empty. Across the room, Ethan knelt beside Lily as she struggled to tie the ribbon around a pastry box. He patiently loosened the knot she had pulled too tightly before letting her try again instead of finishing it himself. "Slow hands," he reminded her with a gentle smile. "Bread teaches patience. Life usually does the same." Lily laughed. "You always say that. Because it keeps proving itself true." She finally tied the ribbon correctly and held up the finished box with quiet pride. Ethan applauded softly as though she had accomplished something extraordinary. Charlotte watched the exchange with growing admiration. There was no performance in his kindness. No audience to impress. It simply seemed to be the way he moved through every ordinary moment. Her phone vibrated across the table. The screen displayed the name of her chief financial officer, Daniel Mercer. She answered quietly. "Good morning, Daniel. How is the site visit?" he asked. "Have you secured the property?" Charlotte looked toward the bakery once more before responding. "Not yet." A short silence followed. "The investors are expecting confirmation today," Daniel reminded her. "That location is the anchor parcel. Without it, the redevelopment becomes significantly more complicated." Charlotte closed the folder. "I understand. Do you anticipate resistance?" he continued. "The owner might negotiate," she answered carefully. Daniel laughed softly. "Everyone negotiates. Increase the offer if necessary. Every building has a price." Charlotte ended the call with a polite goodbye, but the final sentence lingered long after the screen went dark. Every building has a price. She slowly looked around the bakery again. A retired schoolteacher was reading quietly near the fireplace. A young mother bounced a sleepy toddler while sharing a muffin. 2 elderly sisters played cards beside the window exactly as though they had done so every Saturday for years. This place was not simply a building. It was where birthdays were celebrated, grief was softened, friendships were renewed, and lonely mornings became a little less lonely. How could any spreadsheet measure that? Ethan approached carrying a fresh cup of coffee. "You looked like yours needed replacing," he said. Charlotte glanced at the untouched cup still sitting in front of her and smiled with slight embarrassment. "Apparently I was thinking more than drinking." Ethan placed the new mug gently on the table. "That happens here more often than people expect." She looked up at him. "Does it?" "There is something about the smell of fresh bread," he replied. "It reminds people of things they forgot they missed." Charlotte wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "You speak as though you have always owned this place." Ethan looked toward the old photographs hanging above the fireplace. They showed the bakery decades earlier when neighborhood children lined up outside after school carrying a few dollars in loose change. "No," he answered softly. I almost walked away before I ever walked in. Charlotte remained silent, sensing there was more beneath those words. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the back of an empty chair. The day after I lost my job, I drove around for nearly 6 hours because I could not bring myself to tell Lily everything had changed. I kept thinking if I waited long enough, maybe I would wake up somewhere else. Somewhere the meeting had never happened. He smiled gently, though sadness briefly crossed his face. Life does not usually work that way. Charlotte lowered her eyes. Every sentence landed more heavily than the one before it. Ethan continued without bitterness. A few weeks later I found this building. The roof leaked. The ovens barely worked. The windows were covered with plywood. Everyone told me it was a terrible investment. He looked around the room filled with familiar faces. Maybe they were right financially. But they were wrong about hope. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. She wanted to explain the impossible pressure, the collapsing balance sheets, the endless meetings that had led to the layoffs, yet every explanation suddenly sounded smaller than the life standing in front of her. Before she could speak, the bell above the front door chimed again. An elderly gentleman entered carrying a faded photograph protected inside a simple wooden frame. He smiled warmly when he saw Ethan. "I finally found it," he called out. Ethan's eyes brightened with surprise. "Mr. Donnelly, you actually did." The older man carefully handed him the frame. Inside was a photograph of the bakery taken more than 50 years earlier, with children gathered outside and fresh bread displayed proudly in the window. Ethan studied it with quiet wonder before turning it toward Lily. "This," he whispered, "is what we have been trying to bring back." Charlotte looked at the old photograph and then at the room surrounding it. She suddenly realized the redevelopment project was not creating a community. It was preparing to erase one, and without knowing it she had once again arrived at the edge of a decision that could quietly change far more lives than her own. That afternoon the bakery settled into the comfortable rhythm Ethan loved most. The breakfast rush had faded, the ovens hummed steadily, and the sweet fragrance of rising dough mixed with freshly brewed coffee until the entire room seemed wrapped in quiet warmth. Charlotte remained seated by the window far longer than she had planned, studying the old photograph Mr. Donnelly had left behind. It rested against the cash register now, a faded reminder that this little corner of the neighborhood had survived generations because people believed some places were worth protecting. Lily carefully dusted powdered sugar across a tray of pastries before carrying them to the display case. She counted each one twice, determined to arrange them exactly the way her father had taught her. Ethan noticed her concentrating so intensely that he smiled before saying, "Perfection is not about making everything identical. It is about making everything with care." Lily looked up with a thoughtful grin. "So if one cinnamon roll is a little funny looking, it can still be perfect?" Ethan nodded. "Sometimes the ones with the most character are the first to disappear." Charlotte could not help smiling at the exchange. It reminded her that leadership did not always arrive through speeches or authority. Sometimes it looked like a father teaching his daughter that kindness mattered more than flawless appearances. The front door chimed again as another customer entered carrying a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from a nearby farmer's market. The young woman walked directly toward Ethan. "I almost forgot these," she said cheerfully. "They are for the front counter. My grandmother always said your bakery makes people happier, so flowers belong here too." Ethan accepted them with genuine gratitude instead of polite obligation. "Please thank your grandmother for us." Lily immediately searched for a glass pitcher, filled it with fresh water, and arranged the flowers beside the register. The bright yellow blooms instantly transformed the room. Charlotte quietly noticed that no one asked for recognition when they contributed something to the bakery. They simply wanted to belong. Her thoughts drifted back to the towering headquarters of Hayes Foods, where every accomplishment seemed measured through presentations, bonuses, and quarterly reports. Somewhere along the journey the company had forgotten that communities were built one relationship at a time. Her phone vibrated once more. This time it was a message from the chairman of the board. "Need confirmation before market closes. Investors are expecting progress." Charlotte locked the screen without replying. For the first time in years, delaying an answer felt more responsible than giving one too quickly. Ethan noticed the concern crossing her face but did not ask questions. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and lifted a weathered wooden recipe box. Its corners were worn smooth by decades of careful hands. "Would you like to see something?" he asked. Charlotte walked over curiously. He opened the lid with surprising gentleness. Inside rested dozens of handwritten recipe cards, each marked with different dates stretching back more than 60 years. Some carried tiny flower stains. Others had faded pencil notes, squeezed into the margins. "These belong to the original owners," Ethan explained. "When I bought the bakery, I found this box hidden behind one of the broken shelves. The family had moved away years earlier and thought everything was lost." Charlotte carefully picked up one card. The handwriting was elegant, almost artistic. At the bottom, someone had written a single sentence. "Feed people with joy and they will always remember your table." She read the words twice before looking up. "You kept all of these?" Ethan smiled softly. "They were never really mine. I am just taking care of them until someone else needs them." Charlotte closed the box with slow respect. That simple sentence revealed more about Ethan than any resume ever could. He did not see himself as the owner of success. He saw himself as its temporary steward. A sudden burst of laughter filled the bakery as two elementary school boys hurried inside carrying bicycles almost too large for them. They approached the counter with a handful of loose coins. One boy looked embarrassed. "Mr. Brooks, we only have enough for one cookie today." Ethan counted the coins without mentioning that they were several dollars short. He placed two oversized chocolate chip cookies into separate paper bags and slid them across the counter. "Looks like today's special is buy one and the second one somehow follows the first." The boys laughed happily before racing back outside. Lily watched them leave. "Dad," she whispered with a playful smile. "They were short again." Ethan leaned closer. "I know. Are you going to tell them next time?" He shook his head gently. "Someday they will help someone else without keeping score. That will settle the balance." Charlotte stood completely still. She had spent years believing that successful businesses were built through careful accounting. Yet here was a man who quietly trusted generosity to earn its own return. It was not a business strategy. It was a philosophy of life. As afternoon sunlight shifted across the old hardwood floor, Charlotte looked once more at the redevelopment folder waiting silently on the table. The glossy drawings suddenly seemed unable to capture what already existed inside these walls. Investors could finance elegant buildings. Architects could design beautiful spaces. But no blueprint could manufacture trust, compassion, or the quiet dignity that had taken root here, one loaf of bread, one conversation, and one act of kindness at a time. And as she watched Ethan welcome another stranger with the same gentle smile he had offered her that morning, Charlotte slowly realized the decision before her was no longer about a piece of real estate. It was about whether she had the courage to protect something priceless that she herself had almost failed to recognize. Bien tapped. The afternoon light softened into a warm golden glow as the bakery settled into its quietest hours, the kind Ethan had always treasured because it gave him time to prepare for tomorrow while still appreciating today. The steady rhythm of kneading dough echoed gently through the kitchen as Lily stood on a small wooden step stool, carefully measuring flour into a large mixing bowl. She frowned in concentration before looking toward her father. 3 cups exactly?" she asked. Ethan smiled without looking away from the dough beneath his hands. 3 cups exactly. Baking forgives very little, but it rewards patience every single time. Lily carefully leveled the measuring cup with the back of a butter knife before pouring the flour into the bowl. "There," she announced proudly. Ethan glanced over and nodded. "Perfect." Charlotte watched from the doorway leading into the kitchen, surprised that Ethan had invited her behind the counter after the lunch crowd faded. Most restaurant owners guarded their kitchens with quiet suspicion, but Ethan simply handed her a clean apron with an easy smile. "If you are willing to wear a little flour, you are welcome here." Charlotte laughed softly as she tied the apron around her waist. "I should warn you, my cooking experience is limited to coffee." Lily giggled. Then today you get promoted. Ethan chuckled. Around here everyone starts with bread. The simple conversation carried an ease that Charlotte had not experienced in years. There were no titles inside the bakery. No executive assistants, no conference tables, no carefully rehearsed presentations. Just ordinary people sharing ordinary work. Ethan handed her a wooden bowl filled with fresh apples. Would you peel these for tomorrow's pies? Charlotte accepted the bowl almost instinctively. I think I can manage that. As she worked, she noticed how naturally Ethan and Lily moved together. They rarely needed complete sentences. One reached for a towel just as the other offered it. One opened the oven while the other already held the tray. Their quiet teamwork looked less like routine and more like trust built over countless mornings. The scent of cinnamon drifted through the room as Ethan stirred a small saucepan filled with butter, brown sugar, and spices. The smell reminds people that home still exists, he said almost absent-mindedly. Charlotte paused while peeling another apple. You really believe food can do that? Ethan looked toward the old brick oven before answering. I believe people remember how someone made them feel. Sometimes bread simply helps them remember. His words settled gently into the silence. Charlotte realized she had spent years building. Bien tapped the bakery closed its front doors just after sunset, but inside the warmth lingered long after the last customer had gone home. The old brick walls seemed to hold the day's laughter the way they held the comforting scent of butter, cinnamon, and fresh bread. Ethan switched off the glowing sign in the front window before returning to the kitchen, where Lily was already stacking clean mixing bowls with careful determination. She yawned without realizing it, and Ethan smiled. Long day? He asked. Lily stretched her arms above her head. A good day. She paused before adding, Do you think Miss Hayes liked it here? Ethan rinsed flour from his hands beneath the warm water. I think she saw something she was not expecting. Lily tilted her head. Will she come back? Ethan gently dried another baking tray before answering. Sometimes people return because they are hungry. Sometimes they return because they are searching for something they cannot explain. Lily nodded thoughtfully as though that answer made perfect sense. Across town, Charlotte sat alone inside her office overlooking the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected hundreds of lights stretching across the evening, but for the first time in years the view felt strangely distant. The redevelopment folder rested unopened on her polished desk while her thoughts remained inside the little bakery. She could still hear Lily laughing over measuring cups. She could still smell the warm cinnamon bread. She could still remember Ethan thanking every customer, as though each person walking through the door mattered just as much as the first. Her executive assistant quietly stepped inside. The board package for tomorrow's meeting is ready. Charlotte looked up. Thank you, Melissa. The young woman hesitated before speaking again. The directors are expecting your recommendation on the redevelopment project. Charlotte nodded slowly. I know. After Melissa left, silence settled over the office. It was a different kind of silence than the bakery carried. There, silence felt peaceful. Here, it felt heavy. Charlotte stood and walked toward the window. From the 42nd floor, the city appeared organized, efficient, and impressive. Yet she suddenly found herself wondering how many lives were hidden behind the lights below. How many fathers hurried home after long shifts. How many children waited for bedtime stories. How many neighborhoods depended on one familiar place to remind them they belonged somewhere. Her phone rang again. Daniel Mercer spoke before she had finished saying hello. The investors want an update tonight. Charlotte remained calm. I am still evaluating. Daniel sounded surprised. There is not much to evaluate. The numbers are excellent. Numbers do not always tell the whole story, she replied quietly. A short pause followed. Charlotte, Daniel continued carefully, we are responsible for shareholder value. She answered without raising her voice. We are also responsible for the communities we affect. Daniel cleared his throat politely. That is admirable, but communities do not appear on quarterly reports. Charlotte looked out toward the darkening skyline. Perhaps they should. After ending the call, she opened her laptop instead of the redevelopment proposal. Rather than reviewing projected profits, she searched through archived company records from 3 years earlier. Hundreds of employee files appeared on the screen. Performance evaluations, department reorganizations, financial summaries. She typed Ethan Brooks into the search field. His personnel file appeared almost instantly. Senior Process Engineer. 12 years of service. Outstanding performance reviews. Multiple innovation awards. Team leadership recognition. Charlotte slowly scrolled through page after page. Everything suggested a dedicated employee whose career had consistently exceeded expectations. Then she reached the final section. Position eliminated during restructuring. Approved by executive leadership. She frowned. Something did not fit. Ethan's department had ranked among the company's strongest performing divisions before the restructuring. Why had his position disappeared while several lower performing roles remained? She continued reading. A notation caught her attention. Recommendation submitted by Regional Operations Director Thomas Whitmore. Charlotte leaned closer to the screen. She remembered Whitmore well. Charismatic. Confident. Exceptionally persuasive. He had retired shortly after the restructuring. She opened additional documents. Budget summaries. Department comparisons. Internal recommendations. The deeper she searched, the more questions surfaced. Several engineering positions with weaker evaluations had been preserved while Ethan's had been removed. The justification referenced operational redundancy, yet subsequent reports. Morning arrived with a pale golden light stretching across the quiet neighborhood as Ethan unlocked the bakery before sunrise. The streets were still peaceful, the air cool enough to carry the comforting scent of fresh bread far beyond the front door. Inside, the old ovens awakened one by one with their familiar hum, and soon the first batches of dough were rising beneath clean linen towels. Lily entered a few minutes later wearing her favorite blue apron, her backpack still resting on one shoulder before school. She smiled as she breathed in deeply. "It always smells like hope in here," she said. Ethan laughed softly while sprinkling flour across the wooden worktable. "That may be my favorite description yet." She placed her backpack beside the office door and immediately reached for the measuring cups without being asked. Their quiet routine had become as natural as breathing. Neither hurried. Neither complained. Every movement reflected years of learning how to build a peaceful life from ordinary moments. Across the city, Charlotte Hayes arrived at headquarters earlier than anyone else. The marble lobby echoed beneath her footsteps as she carried a cup of black coffee toward the executive floor. Instead of walking directly into her office, she entered the corporate archive room where decades of financial records and personnel files rested behind carefully labeled cabinets. The archive manager looked surprised. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes. Is there something I can help you locate?" Charlotte offered a polite smile. "I need everything connected to the restructuring from 3 years ago. Engineering, operations, executive approvals, internal recommendations, all of it." Within minutes, several storage boxes sat across a large conference table. Charlotte quietly opened the first folder. Meeting minutes. Budget projections. Department analyses. She read each page carefully instead of skimming as she normally would. One document immediately caught her attention. It summarized cost-saving recommendations submitted by Regional Operations Director Thomas Whitmore. Several employee positions were marked as essential, while others were recommended for elimination. Ethan Brooks appeared on the second page. Charlotte frowned. Attached beside his name was a brief handwritten note that had never appeared in the electronic file. Resistant to strategic restructuring. Position can be absorbed by consulting support. She stared at the sentence. It sounded unlike every performance evaluation she had already reviewed. She searched further until another document surfaced. It contained internal engineering recommendations signed by Ethan himself months before the restructuring. The report warned that replacing experienced in-house engineers with outside consultants would increase long-term operating costs while reducing equipment reliability. Charlotte slowly leaned back in her chair. Ethan had not resisted progress. He had questioned an expensive decision with documented evidence. She continued reading until she found an email chain between Thomas Whitmore and several senior managers. Most of the messages discussed staffing reductions, but one sentence stood apart. Brooks continues raising objections. Easier to remove the obstacle than debate the proposal every quarter. Charlotte closed her eyes for a brief moment. The words felt cold despite their professional tone. She remembered the endless meetings from that difficult year. Hundreds of decisions had crossed her desk every week. She had trusted experienced executives to present accurate recommendations because no single leader could personally investigate every case. Yet, sitting alone in the archive room, she realized trust without verification sometimes carried an enormous human cost. Meanwhile, the bakery slowly welcomed another beautiful morning. A local police officer stopped by for coffee before beginning his shift. A high school teacher purchased muffins for the faculty lounge. A young father carrying his toddler accepted a warm cinnamon roll after Ethan noticed the little boy staring through the display case with wide eyes. Every customer left smiling. Lily watched quietly before whispering, "Dad, do you ever get tired of giving people extra things?" Ethan smiled while arranging fresh croissants. "Kindness does not make me tired." He looked toward the front windows where sunlight spilled across the old hardwood floor. "It usually gives me more energy than sleep does." Lily nodded as though she had expected exactly that answer. Just before leaving for school, she hugged her father tightly. "See you this afternoon?" Ethan kissed the top of her head. "Have a wonderful day. Remember to be kind even when nobody notices." She smiled brightly. "Especially then." After she disappeared around the corner, Ethan stood quietly for a moment watching until she was safely out of sight. Only then did he return to the ovens. Back at headquarters, Charlotte carried several copied documents into her office. She spread them across her desk beside the redevelopment proposal. Side by side, the papers told two completely different stories. One promised financial growth through demolition and expansion. The other suggested that years earlier an honest employee might have lost everything because he refused to stay silent when numbers did not match reality. Her assistant gently knocked before entering. "The board meeting begins in 30 minutes. Charlotte looked up slowly. "Please move my presentation to the end of the agenda." Melissa appeared surprised. "Of course. Is something wrong?" Charlotte gathered the documents into a single folder. "I am beginning to think I asked the wrong questions." As Melissa quietly left, Charlotte looked once more at Ethan's personnel file. 12 years of faithful service reduced to a single signature she had barely remembered. Yet somehow he had rebuilt his life without bitterness, creating a place where strangers became neighbors and ordinary mornings became small reminders that grace still existed. Charlotte closed the folder with quiet determination. She no longer wanted to know whether the redevelopment project made financial sense. She wanted to know why an honorable man had been treated as though his integrity had become an inconvenience. Because somewhere inside those forgotten records rested a truth that had remained silent for 3 long years, and she had finally decided that silence would not be allowed to continue. The boardroom remained unusually quiet as Charlotte Hayes placed the thick folder of personnel records in front of her seat instead of the polished redevelopment presentation everyone expected. Morning sunlight filtered through the towering glass windows, reflecting across the long walnut conference table where directors, legal advisors, and senior executives waited with carefully prepared notes. Daniel Mercer noticed the change immediately. "I thought we were reviewing the neighborhood redevelopment proposal first," he said politely. Charlotte folded her hands together before answering. "We will discuss it, but not before we review something far more important." Several board members exchanged curious glances. Charlotte opened the first folder. "Yesterday I visited one of the buildings included in our proposal. I also began reviewing records connected to our restructuring from 3 years ago." Daniel leaned forward. "Those are unrelated matters." Charlotte looked directly at him. "I no longer believe they are." The room fell still. She continued calmly. "Before we vote on removing another business from that neighborhood, I want to understand whether this company has fully learned from decisions made in the past. She slid copies of several documents across the table. Please read page 4. Quiet pages turned. Eyes narrowed. Pen stopped moving. One director looked up first. These recommendations do not match the employee evaluations. Charlotte nodded. Exactly. She explained the inconsistencies she had discovered, the engineering reports, the consultant contracts, and the handwritten notes that appear nowhere in the official summaries. She did not accuse anyone. She simply presented facts one after another, allowing the evidence to speak more loudly than emotion ever could. Daniel adjusted his glasses before responding. Thomas Whitmore retired years ago. Revisiting those decisions serves little purpose today. Charlotte answered without raising her voice. Correcting the truth always serves a purpose. No one interrupted her after that. Meanwhile, several miles away, Ethan stood outside the bakery sweeping the front sidewalk before the afternoon customers arrived. A gentle autumn breeze carried yellow leaves across the quiet street while neighbors stopped to wave as they passed. Lily returned from school with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She hurried directly toward the bakery, smiling before she even reached the door. Dad, Mrs. Reynolds picked my essay to read in front of the class. Ethan rested the broom against the wall. Congratulations. What did you write about? Lily smiled proudly. Home. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That is a big subject. She nodded. I wrote that home is not always where you start. Sometimes it is where people help you become who you were meant to be. Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet pride. Your mother would have loved that. Lily slipped her hand into his as they walked inside together. She noticed the old recipe box resting near the register and carefully dusted it before placing it back exactly where it belonged. Dad, she asked softly, do you think people can change after they make mistakes? Ethan paused while placing fresh bread into the display case. Yes. Even very big mistakes? He smiled gently. Sometimes those are the mistakes that change people the most. Lily thought about his answer for a moment. Then maybe everybody deserves another chance. Ethan looked at her thoughtfully before replying. Everybody deserves the opportunity to earn one. Across town, the board meeting had stretched well beyond its scheduled time. One independent director spoke quietly after reviewing the documents. Charlotte, are you suggesting an internal investigation? She answered immediately. Yes. Another director nodded slowly. I agree. These records deserve independent review. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. This could create unnecessary public attention. Charlotte remained composed. Ignoring the truth has never protected a company's reputation. Living by the truth does. The chairman, who had remained silent until then, closed the folder in front of him. The motion before us is simple. Do we authorize an independent review of the restructuring process and postpone the redevelopment vote until those findings are complete? One by one, hands began to rise around the table. Daniel remained still. Every other director voted yes. The chairman looked toward Charlotte. The motion carries unanimously except for one abstention. Charlotte quietly thanked the board before gathering her papers. She knew the investigation would take weeks, perhaps months. She also knew there was no turning back now. That evening she drove toward the bakery again, not carrying contracts or redevelopment plans this time, but only a small cardboard box. The neighborhood looked peaceful beneath the fading light. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks while families walked home carrying grocery bags and greeting one another by name. Charlotte parked across the street for a long moment before stepping out. She realized she was nervous in a way no shareholder meeting had ever made her feel. Inside the box rested copies of the documents she had uncovered. She was not yet ready to share them. The investigation had only begun. But she wanted Ethan to know one thing before rumors or legal notices reached him. She crossed the street slowly as the bakery windows glowed with their familiar warmth. Through the glass she saw Ethan laughing quietly while Lily carefully frosted a tray of cupcakes. Neither noticed her standing outside. For a brief moment Charlotte simply watched them, understanding more clearly than ever that the strongest people were often the ones who rebuilt their lives without demanding the world apologize first. She reached for the brass door handle, paused, and took a slow breath. This time she was not entering as a chief executive officer, a property developer, or the woman who had once signed his termination papers. She was walking through that familiar doorway as someone searching for the courage to face the truth with honesty, humility, and the hope that perhaps even broken trust could begin to heal. Bien tapped. Charlotte gently pushed open the bakery door, and the familiar bell above it rang with the same soft welcome it offered every visitor. Ethan looked up from the display case where he had been arranging fresh dinner rolls, while Lily carefully finished spreading white frosting across the last cupcake. For a brief moment no one spoke. The quiet carried no anger, only the weight of unfinished history waiting patiently to be understood. Ethan offered the same calm smile he gave every guest. "Good evening." Charlotte returned the greeting almost instinctively. "Good evening, Ethan." Lily noticed the small cardboard box in Charlotte's hands and tilted her head with curiosity. "Did you bring dessert?" she asked with innocent enthusiasm. Charlotte laughed softly, grateful for the child's warmth. "I am afraid not this time." Lily smiled anyway. "That is okay. We already have plenty." Ethan looked toward his daughter with gentle amusement. "Why do not you finish putting the chairs on the tables in the dining room? We are almost closed." Lily nodded before carrying the last tray toward the front. She hummed quietly as she worked, giving the two adults a little privacy without realizing she was doing exactly that. Charlotte rested the cardboard box on a nearby table. "I wanted to come back before the day ended." Ethan wiped his hands on a clean kitchen towel. "I am glad you did." His answer surprised her. She had expected distance, perhaps caution. Instead, she found simple courtesy. She looked around the bakery once more. The evening light poured through the front windows, casting long golden reflections across the old hardwood floor. The framed photographs, the recipe box, the fresh flowers, and the handwritten menu all seemed to belong together like chapters of the same story. Finally, she looked back at Ethan. "May I ask you something?" He nodded. "Of course." She hesitated for a moment. "Why were you never angry with me?" Ethan remained silent just long enough to choose his words carefully. "I was hurt." He smiled gently, though sadness briefly touched his eyes. "There is a difference." Charlotte lowered her gaze. "Most people would not separate the two." Ethan folded the towel neatly before placing it beside the register. "For a while I did not separate them either." His voice remained steady, almost peaceful. "The day I left the company I believed everything I had worked for had disappeared in a single afternoon. I drove around for hours because I could not imagine telling Lily that our lives had changed." Charlotte listened without interrupting. Ethan continued quietly. "Eventually I realized that carrying anger into my home would only make her pay for something she never caused." Charlotte felt her throat tighten. "I never imagined." Ethan raised one hand gently, not to silence her, but to reassure her. "I know." The kindness in those two words unsettled her more deeply than blame ever could have. She looked toward the cardboard box. "I found something." Ethan remained still. Charlotte slowly opened the box and removed several copied documents. "These are not official conclusions," she explained carefully. "An independent review has only just begun. But I believed you deserved to know that I started asking questions." Ethan looked at the papers without reaching for them. "Questions about what?" Charlotte took a slow breath. "About your departure from the company." She explained the inconsistent records, the engineering reports, the handwritten recommendations, and the emails she had uncovered in the archives. She never exaggerated. She never rushed. Every sentence rested on documented facts instead of assumptions. Ethan listened quietly from beginning to end. When she finally finished, the bakery became silent again except for the gentle ticking of the old wall clock. "I did not know any of that," Ethan admitted softly. Charlotte looked at him with genuine regret. "Neither did I." He studied the documents resting inside the box before speaking again. You are trying to understand what really happened? She nodded. Yes. Ethan slowly smiled, though there was no triumph in his expression. Then you are already doing something many people never choose to do. Charlotte looked confused. What is that? You are allowing the truth to matter more than your pride. The words settled quietly between them. The next morning began long before sunrise for both of them, although either knew the other was already awake. Ethan stood inside the quiet bakery while the first batch of sourdough slowly rose beneath linen cloths, the old brick oven filling the room with gentle warmth as rain tapped softly against the front windows. He moved with the calm rhythm that had become his new life, measuring flour, checking temperatures, and humming an old melody Lily's mother used to sing while baking on Saturday mornings. Every loaf reminded him that good things could not be rushed. Every sunrise reminded him that another chance had already been given. Across the city, Charlotte sat alone in her office with a legal pad, several archived reports, and a growing stack of copied emails spread across her desk. The independent investigators had worked through the night, tracing approval chains, financial records, consultant contracts, and executive correspondence that had not been reviewed in years. At exactly 8:15 that morning, the lead investigator, retired federal compliance attorney Margaret Collins, entered Charlotte's office carrying another thick binder. She placed it gently on the desk before speaking. We have identified several inconsistencies that deserve immediate attention. Charlotte looked up. How serious? Margaret opened the binder to a bookmarked page. More serious than we originally believed. She explained that Ethan's engineering division had repeatedly submitted recommendations that would have saved the company millions of dollars over several years by modernizing production equipment through phased upgrades instead of expensive outsourced consulting agreements. Internal projections prepared by Ethan's team had later proven remarkably accurate, yet those reports had quietly disappeared from executive planning meetings. Charlotte listened without interrupting. Margaret turned another page. Several months before the restructuring, Regional Operations Director Thomas Whitmore approved consulting contracts with a firm managed by one of his longtime business associates. Those contracts replaced responsibilities previously handled by Ethan's department. Charlotte slowly leaned back in her chair. Conflict of interest? Margaret nodded carefully. That is one possibility. We are still verifying every document before making formal conclusions. Charlotte continued reading. Another email appeared. Thomas Whitmore had written to senior managers that resistance from engineering leadership threatened implementation timelines. Attached beneath the message was Ethan's respectful but detailed response explaining why the consulting proposal carried unnecessary financial risk. He never attacked anyone personally. He simply presented facts supported by research, safety evaluations, and projected operating costs. Charlotte quietly closed her eyes. She remembered that season well. The board demanded rapid savings. Executives favored quick solutions. Ethan had asked difficult questions supported by evidence, and somewhere along the way honest disagreement had quietly become professional inconvenience. Margaret gently slid another folder across the desk. There is something else. Charlotte opened it. Inside rested performance reviews completed by employees who had worked directly under Ethan. Every evaluation described the same qualities. Patient leadership. Exceptional integrity. Calm. Under pressure. Willing to mentor younger engineers. Places people before recognition. Charlotte read every page slowly. One handwritten comment near the bottom caught her attention. He never takes credit alone. If something succeeds, he always thanks the entire team first. She stared at the sentence for several silent seconds. The man described inside these reports sounded exactly like the father serving warm bread to strangers every morning inside the little bakery. Success had never changed his character because either failure nor success had ever defined it. Margaret broke the silence gently. I have investigated corporate ethics for more than 30 years. Charlotte looked toward her. What do you think happened? Margaret answered carefully. I believe an honorable employee challenged an expensive decision, and several influential people decided removing the voice was easier than answering the questions. Charlotte lowered her eyes. Including me? Margaret shook her head. The documents suggest you relied on summaries prepared by others. Responsibility and intent are not always the same thing, but responsibility still matters. Those words stayed with Charlotte long after the investigator left. Meanwhile, the bakery welcomed another busy morning. Rain had driven more neighbors indoors, and every table soon filled with customers warming their hands around coffee mugs while fresh pastries disappeared almost as quickly as they left the oven. Lily helped a young boy choose his first blueberry muffin while Ethan quietly prepared extra soup and bread for the community shelter that received donations every Wednesday afternoon. Nothing about the morning felt extraordinary to him. He simply continued living the life he had chosen after deciding that bitterness would never become his daughter's inheritance. Shortly after noon, a delivery driver arrived carrying several large boxes addressed to Brooks Bakery. Ethan looked surprised. "I am not expecting anything." The driver checked the shipping label. "Paid in full. No return address." Curious, Ethan opened the first box. Inside were elegant wooden picture frames, archival glass, mounting supplies, and small brass plaques suitable for preserving historic photographs. Lily gasped with delight. "Dad, now we can protect every old picture people bring us." Ethan searched the boxes for a note but found only one small envelope tucked beneath the packing paper. Inside rested a single handwritten card. "Preserve what matters." No signature appeared beneath the words. Ethan quietly smiled because he already knew who had sent them. Several miles away, Charlotte stood beside her office window watching gentle rain wash across the city skyline. For the first time in many years, she felt that leadership was not about protecting her past decisions, but about having the courage to correct them. She knew the investigation was only beginning. She also knew the truth was moving steadily toward the surface, and when it finally arrived, it would not simply restore one man's reputation. It would challenge everyone involved to decide whether dignity, honesty, and quiet grace were values worthy of defending when they carried a personal cost. 3 weeks passed with the quiet steadiness that only honest work seemed capable of creating. Every morning the bakery filled with the comforting fragrance of fresh bread. Every afternoon neighbors gathered around the worn wooden tables with coffee and conversation. And every evening Ethan and Lily closed the front door with grateful hearts rather than exhausted ones. Life had become beautifully ordinary again, and Ethan had learned that ordinary days were often life's greatest blessings. He had not called the investigators. He had not contacted reporters. He had not tried to defend his reputation in public. He simply continued serving every customer with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through the hardest years of his life. Charlotte, however, found that every new document uncovered another piece of a story that should never have remained hidden. The independent investigation expanded beyond personnel files into financial audits, consulting agreements, archived meeting recordings, and executive correspondence. What initially appeared to be a single questionable recommendation slowly revealed a much larger pattern. Several consulting contracts approved during the restructuring had dramatically exceeded market rates. Internal engineering proposals had repeatedly been dismissed without meaningful review. Experienced employees who questioned those decisions had quietly disappeared from the organization one by one. None of the evidence suggested dramatic scandal or sensational misconduct. Instead, it revealed something more common and perhaps more dangerous. Pride had been allowed to outweigh wisdom, and convenience had slowly replaced accountability. Charlotte sat with Margaret Collins late one afternoon as the final investigative summary was placed on the conference table between them. Margaret carefully removed her reading glasses before speaking. "We have completed every verification requested by the board." Charlotte looked at the bound report without opening it. "What is your conclusion?" Margaret answered with calm certainty. "Thomas Whitmore intentionally misrepresented the operational recommendations submitted by Ethan Brooks and several members of his engineering team. He selectively removed supporting data from executive summaries, exaggerated claims of organizational resistance, and promoted outside consulting contracts that directly benefited longtime business associates." Charlotte remained silent. Margaret continued. The restructuring itself may have been financially necessary. The information used to make several individual decisions was not. Charlotte slowly opened the report. The findings were detailed, thoroughly documented, and supported by months of verified evidence. Every question she had carried into the investigation now had an answer, but those answers brought no satisfaction. They only deepened her understanding of how easily good intentions could become harmful when leaders stopped asking difficult questions. The board assembled 2 days later for a special session unlike any in the company's recent history. No investors attended. No media received invitations. The meeting was devoted entirely to truth. Charlotte summarized the findings without assigning blame beyond the documented evidence. She accepted responsibility for approving decisions based on incomplete information. She acknowledged that leadership required more than trusting reports prepared by others. It required the courage to verify, to listen, and sometimes to slow down when human lives were affected. The chairman quietly closed the investigative report after every director had finished reading it. The findings are unanimous, he said. The company failed an honorable employee. We cannot change the past, but we can decide how we respond to it. Every director voted in favor of formally accepting the investigation, correcting Ethan's employment record, canceling the redevelopment project involving the bakery, and implementing new review procedures designed to prevent similar failures in the future. Daniel Mercer remained unusually quiet throughout the meeting. When the final vote concluded, he slowly stood. I spent years believing efficiency solved every problem, he admitted. Today I was reminded that fairness is equally important. Charlotte nodded with quiet respect. Honest reflection deserved acknowledgement, even when it arrived late. That same afternoon, Ethan loaded several baskets of fresh bread into his pickup truck before driving to the neighborhood community shelter, as he did every Wednesday. Lily rode beside him holding a handwritten list of soups requested for the following week. The shelter director welcomed them warmly. Your bread disappears faster than anything we serve, she said with a grateful smile. Ethan laughed softly. That means we will bake a little more next Wednesday. As they unloaded the baskets, one elderly volunteer quietly approached Ethan. People around here keep saying your bakery changed the neighborhood, he remarked. Ethan shook his head gently. The neighborhood changed us first. Lily smiled because she had heard her father say those words before. On the drive back to the bakery, she looked out the window at children playing in a nearby park before asking, Dad, do you think people ever find out when they were right all along? Ethan kept his eyes on the road for a thoughtful moment. Sometimes they do, he answered. Sometimes they never know. Lily looked toward him. Does it matter? Ethan smiled with a peaceful confidence that had slowly become part of his character. It matters that you keep doing what is right even before anyone notices. As the late afternoon sun settled across the old brick storefront, Charlotte stood on the opposite side of the street holding the final investigative report beneath one arm. The documents inside no longer contained questions. They contained the truth. And for the first time since she had walked into the little bakery weeks earlier, she believed she was finally prepared to return, not carrying uncertainty or apology alone, but carrying the kind of honesty that could begin restoring what pride, silence, and incomplete knowledge had once taken away. The following Saturday morning the bakery opened earlier than usual, but Ethan did not know that the day waiting beyond the front door would become one of the quietest turning points of his life. The first rays of sunlight painted the old brick walls with a warm amber glow, while the familiar aroma of fresh bread drifted through the neighborhood like an invitation to slow down. Lily arranged fresh flowers beside the register, replacing the previous week's bouquet with bright white daisies gathered from the local farmer's market. She stepped back, smiled with satisfaction, and looked toward her father. Everything feels extra happy today, she said. Ethan laughed softly as he removed a tray of golden dinner rolls from the oven. Sometimes happiness arrives before we understand why. The morning crowd came and went with its usual rhythm. Families carried home warm loaves for breakfast. Elderly neighbors lingered over coffee. Children pressed their hands against a pastry display while trying to choose between cookies and cinnamon rolls. Nothing felt unusual until just before noon when several familiar black sedans quietly pulled to the curb across the street. There were no flashing cameras, no reporters, and no dramatic arrival. Charlotte Hayes stepped out first, followed by the chairman of the board, Margaret Collins, Daniel Mercer, and several other company leaders. Each carried only a slim folder. They entered the bakery together, and the gentle bell above the door rang once again. Conversation inside the bakery slowly faded. Ethan looked up from the counter with calm curiosity. Charlotte met his eyes before speaking. "Good morning, Ethan." He smiled politely. "Good morning. It is nice to see you again." Charlotte looked around the bakery filled with neighbors, framed photographs, flowers, and the quiet warmth that had slowly become part of her own heart. Then she turned back toward Ethan. "May we borrow a few moments of your time?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." The chairman stepped forward holding a single envelope. His voice remained steady but sincere. "Mr. Brooks, several weeks ago our board authorized an independent investigation into decisions surrounding the corporate restructuring that ended your employment." The bakery became completely still. Even the soft music playing through the ceiling speakers seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. The chairman continued. "The investigation concluded that information presented to executive leadership regarding your performance, your recommendations, and your professional conduct was incomplete and materially misleading. You acted with integrity. Your documented recommendations were correct. Your record should never have reflected otherwise." Charlotte quietly accepted the envelope from the chairman before walking toward Ethan herself. "This contains the official correction of your employment record, a formal apology from our board of directors, and the unanimous decision to permanently cancel the redevelopment project involving this building." Ethan accepted the envelope with both hands but did not immediately open it. Charlotte continued, her voice carrying genuine humility rather than corporate formality. 3 years ago I signed a decision without knowing the full truth. That responsibility belongs to me regardless of my intentions. I cannot give you back those lost years. I cannot erase the pain that decision caused you or Lily. But I can stand here today and tell the truth publicly, because your dignity deserves nothing less. Silence settled gently across the room. Several long-time customers quietly lowered their eyes. Others smiled through tears they made no effort to hide. Ethan looked down at the unopened envelope before lifting his eyes toward Charlotte once more. "Thank you," he said simply. Those 2 words surprised almost everyone standing inside the bakery. Charlotte looked genuinely puzzled. "You are thanking me?" Ethan smiled with quiet grace. "You chose the difficult path instead of the convenient one. That deserves gratitude." Margaret Collins watched the exchange with thoughtful admiration. She had spent an entire career investigating conflict, yet she rarely witnessed reconciliation arrive with such quiet dignity. Charlotte took one careful breath before opening the final folder she carried. "There is one more matter." She removed a formal letter embossed with the company's seal. "The board unanimously voted to offer you the position of Chief Operations Officer for our National Manufacturing Division. The role includes full executive authority, restoration of seniority, equity participation, and the opportunity to lead the operational reforms your recommendations envisioned years ago." The room became silent once again. Lily looked toward her father with wide eyes. Several neighbors smiled proudly, already imagining the answer they expected him to give. Ethan read the offer carefully from beginning to end before folding it with respectful precision. He looked around the bakery, at the old photographs lining the walls, the handwritten recipes, the flowers resting beside the register, and finally at Lily, who smiled with complete trust. He gently returned the letter to Charlotte. "It is an extraordinary opportunity," he said warmly, "and I am deeply honored by the confidence behind it." Charlotte searched his face, already sensing the answer before he spoke it aloud. Ethan smiled peacefully. "But I cannot accept." No one moved. No one interrupted. Ethan continued with the same calm voice that had carried him through every season of loss and renewal. 3 years ago I believed I had lost my purpose when I lost my career. I was wrong. My purpose was simply waiting somewhere else. Every morning this bakery gives my daughter and me the chance to serve our neighbors, to build something honest together, and to remember that success is measured by the lives we warm, not the titles we hold. I would rather spend the rest of my life baking bread with Lily than spend another day wondering whether I belong somewhere else. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment before slowly smiling. There was disappointment, but there was also unmistakable respect. She extended her hand. Ethan accepted it without hesitation. Then, she said softly, "Please allow us to support this bakery in every honest way that respects your independence." Ethan nodded. That would be a gift we could gladly accept. Around them the bakery slowly filled once more with quiet conversation, warm laughter, and the comforting fragrance of fresh bread, while every person in the room understood that true greatness had never been standing behind a polished executive desk. It had been standing quietly behind a wooden bakery counter all along. Autumn quietly gave way to winter, and before anyone seemed to notice, Brooks Bakery had become more than a neighborhood business. It had become part of the rhythm of the town itself. Every morning before sunrise, the warm glow from its front windows spilled onto the sidewalk like a promise that someone was already awake, already preparing something made with care. Parents stopped in before work. Children pressed their noses against the pastry case after school. Elderly neighbors lingered over coffee without anyone rushing them toward the door. Ethan never changed the way he greeted people. Every customer received the same warm smile, the same steady kindness, and the same quiet respect, whether they bought a single dinner roll or enough bread to feed an entire church gathering. Lily grew taller that winter, and with every passing month she became more confident inside the bakery. She could prepare dough on her own, decorate cakes with surprising precision, and welcome every stranger as though she had known them for years. One snowy Saturday morning she carefully hung another framed photograph on the growing memory wall. It showed the bakery exactly as it had looked on the day Ethan first reopened the doors. The windows were still cracked then. The paint had barely dried. The sign leaned slightly to one side. Yet both of them were standing outside smiling as though they already knew everything would somehow be all right. Charlotte stood nearby holding 2 cups of coffee. Over the months she had quietly become a familiar face inside the bakery. She no longer arrived with assistants or schedules filled with meetings. Sometimes she stopped by before work. Sometimes she came on quiet Sunday afternoons simply to enjoy a slice of pie while reading reports that somehow felt less overwhelming beside the old brick walls. She never tried to change the bakery. She simply appreciated it for what it already was. The board honored every promise made that unforgettable day. The redevelopment project was permanently withdrawn. New corporate review policies were introduced throughout Hayes Foods, requiring greater transparency, stronger employee protections, and independent oversight for major restructuring decisions. The company also established the Brooks Integrity Fellowship, a yearly program supporting young engineers who demonstrated technical excellence, humility, and servant leadership. Ethan politely asked that his name never appear on advertisements promoting the fellowship. Charlotte smiled when she heard his request. "You still prefer to stay in the background," she said one morning. Ethan laughed softly while sliding a fresh loaf from the oven. "Bread rises best when nobody keeps opening the oven door to admire it." Charlotte shook her head with quiet amusement. "You always manage to explain life through baking." Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. "It has been a good teacher." One afternoon a young engineering student entered the bakery carrying a newspaper clipping about the fellowship. He recognized Ethan immediately and nervously asked, "Is it true that you turned down an executive position?" Several customers quietly looked up from their tables. Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "I did not turn down success." He looked around the room at the families talking together, the children laughing over cookies, the neighbors greeting one another by name, and Lily placing another tray of fresh cinnamon rolls into the display case. "I simply discovered that success had already found me." The student smiled thoughtfully before thanking him. After he left, Lily leaned toward her father with a playful grin. "That sounded like one of your bakery speeches." Ethan laughed. Maybe I have been spending too much time around bread. Winter slowly melted into spring. The flower boxes outside the front windows bloomed again, just as they had the year before. New photographs continued filling the memory wall. Children who had once needed help reaching the cookie jar were suddenly tall enough to order for themselves. The old recipe box remained safely displayed near the register, reminding everyone that good things were worth preserving. On the first warm morning of April, Ethan unlocked the bakery before sunrise as he always did. He paused for a moment on the front step, breathing in the cool morning air while birds welcomed another day. Charlotte arrived a few minutes later carrying 2 paper cups of coffee instead of buying them somewhere else. She handed one to Ethan without saying a word. Together they watched the neighborhood slowly wake. Delivery trucks rolled by. Joggers waved as they passed. Lights turned on inside nearby homes. Lily soon opened the front door from inside the bakery and smiled at both of them. "Are you two coming in?" she asked. "The cinnamon rolls are almost ready." Ethan looked toward Charlotte. She smiled warmly. "We should not keep your customers waiting." They stepped inside together, and the familiar bell above the door rang softly once more. The old bakery felt exactly as it always had, filled with warmth, fresh bread, gentle laughter, and the quiet dignity of ordinary people choosing kindness every single day. Sometimes the world believes miracles arrive through great wealth, powerful titles, or extraordinary achievements. But every now and then, a forgotten bakery quietly reminds everyone that the greatest miracle is a heart that refuses to become bitter after being broken, because when grace is stronger than resentment, when truth is chosen over convenience, and when love is measured by the lives it quietly nourishes, even the busiest room will eventually grow silent long enough to recognize what genuine greatness has looked like all along.